Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you on this rather chilly March night. We're here to celebrate Anne Cadwallader's debut novel, Crossing Over, tonight. And I'm delighted to be, my name is Rosie Cowan, and I'm delighted to be comparing this event. Anne is a very dear friend of mine. We've known each other for, almost 30 years, Anne. I first met her in a chilly car park, waiting for a press conference, and she said to me, "Come back to my house, you can phone your story over, and I have made Irish stew for lunch." Well, I took up that invitation, and we have been firm friends ever since. I'm not surprised that Anne, she was a wonderful journalist, author of two highly acclaimed factual books, and I am not surprised that she's turned her hand to fiction. I've had the privilege of reading this book already, and I know that you're really going to enjoy the excerpts and the chat about it tonight.
Okay, I'm going to give a short speech and then read a couple of extracts from the book. This is the first time I've ever spoken at the launch of a novel, so, as I'm a thoroughly modern pensioner, I asked AI what I should include. AI said, "Thank those who helped along the way, share the journey of writing, and make the book feel personal." Thanking people is, of course, important to the thankees, but a crashing bore for everyone else. So all I will say is that there are people here who know how much they helped me, either through encouraging me, guiding me through the legal maze, sorting out computer and social media issues, or by helping me care for Jerry through his long illness. They're all acknowledged in the book. Thank you all for attending, and particular thanks to Mary Fian of Mercia Press, who also published Lethal Allies, and to her head of books, Dee Collins, who's been remarkably patient. Now, the story behind Crossing Over really starts in 1982, when, on my very first overnight shift at the BBC, an RUC press officer rang the newsroom to say a car had burst through a roadblock and the police had opened fire in self-defense, killing 3 IRA men. You don't need me to tell you this was not the case. But innocently enough, I wrote up the story and it was the lead on the breakfast programs. The anger of being lied to has never left me. Tectonic plates began to move inside my head. As some of you know, the last few years have not been an easy ride, but in my darkest moments, writing this book was one ray of hope. I'm not sure how I will replace it, unless it's by writing another. I began writing it not just to make myself feel better for having repeated the lie the police gave me in 1982, but almost as a hobby, a challenge, just to see if I could do it. Gradually, it took on a life of its own and then became all-consuming. I half expect Lena to burst into this room and start swearing at me for exposing all her confidential secrets. I have to remind myself that Lena doesn't exist. What I hope sets this book apart is that the people in it are real and grounded and well-rounded. There are goodies and baddies, but their actions are explained by living in a world that forces them to take decisions, some better than others. Those truly to blame are the politicians, civil servants, security agents, and others who created the conditions in which my characters are forced to live. I hope people here will recognize elements of people they know themselves or know about. I hope none of the characters makes decisions that are incomprehensible, whatever their relative merits. I also hope that people enjoy reading the book. Both Holy Cross and Lethal Allies were hard to read and hard to write. In stark contrast, Crossing Over was mostly huge fun. I genuinely hope, no bullshit, that it's an entertaining read. I'll be pleased to answer questions later, but for the moment, I'm going to read some short excerpts to give you a taste. Thank you. Lena arrives in Belfast, and after persuading her boss that she can be trusted, she's allowed to go and meet Troubles-related clients. So this is her first meeting in Crumlin Road Jail with her first loyalist client. Buttoning her coat tight against a wind whistling down from Divis Mountain, Lena drove the following afternoon to Crumlin Road Jail. In the cramped legal block, there were already several other solicitors holding sotto voce meetings with their clients. Lena waited as calmly as possible for Barrett to arrive. She caught herself wondering what someone might look like whose heart was so pitch black he would sneak up on a defenseless fellow human being and shoot him dead. The door opened and in came a bull-necked warder followed by the equally tough-looking Barrett. He was limping slightly, but it didn't stop him swinging a leg dramatically over the bench on his side of the table, giving her an unwanted eyeful of his crotch. Lena cast a quick eye over her new client. He was, as she'd anticipated, a shaven head, heavily tattooed, muscular man straight out of central casting. "Hello, doll, so you're Buchanan's replacement," he opened. "How do you do, Mr. Barrett? My name is Lena Dawson. Pleased to meet you. As you can hear, I'm English, but I'm fully apprised of your case. Perhaps you can begin by telling me your understanding of how it stands." "Miss Dawson, it is Miss, isn't it? We have an hour together, and you'll be gone in 5 minutes if we talk about my case. And that would be a shame. For me, anyhow, I don't have many visitors." "This is not a social call, Mr. Barrett. I'm here to discuss your legal situation. I have other work waiting for me back in the office. If you choose not to give me your thoughts, I can leave. On the other hand, we might discuss how to get you acquitted." "Well, for all I know, you could be one of those lefty English do-gooders who think the poor Catholics are downtrodden and the IRA are the good guys. My views on the IRA and the organization with which you're allegedly connected have no bearing on you as my client. What do you think of Ian Paisley, then?" "My views on him are also irrelevant. You're facing a murder charge, Mr. Barrett. That's what I'm here to discuss." "There's no one over in your bloody parliament can hold a candle to Paisley, but you all think you're so bloody superior, so you do." Lena, simultaneously shocked and amused, tried to hide a smile by leaning under the table to lift documents out of her briefcase. Barrett, however, had noticed her reaction, and his mood darkened. He had a short fuse. "Don't you dare laugh. You lot haven't got a fucking clue. You think you know what's going on over here, but what do you care about the IRA blowing up women and children?" Lena decided the only sensible response was to become more distant professional. "Mr. Barrett, I share your outrage at violence, and these are clearly difficult and important matters, but we're not here to discuss them. I'm here to talk to you about the charges you face, very serious charges. Your statement in the file says you're innocent and the evidence against you is untrue. Tell me about that instead. I'm here to listen and to help." Barrett grunted and settled down. So that was her first meeting with her first loyalist client. Lena subsequently begins dating a UDR man. And on their first date, they meet in a restaurant which his family owns. And as she waited for his arrival, she contrasted their status. She was a mere office junior, a know-nothing from London, while he was her wealthy employer's son. As he sat down beside her, however, she decided to make no concessions. Edward threw the ball in by asking politely if her father ever talked about his days in Kenya. "My father rarely speaks about his experiences in the army. I suspect it's confidential," said Lena. "What's it like having a clergyman as a father?" "Dad hardly talks about God or the Bible, at least not to me." "So what do you talk about?" "I suppose, like most adults, we discuss the merits and demerits of the British Empire, Mrs. Thatcher, privatisation of the railways. Now that I'm a lawyer, we talk about judicial reviews and so on." Lena had hoped to gauge his character on how and which of these topics he picked up, but he ignored them all. "You haven't told me about your mother. Charlotte, isn't it?" Of all the subjects he might have chosen, she thought her mother was certainly the least appealing. "Well, Mother loves gardening, but her arthritis makes it difficult. She can't cook, which annoys Dad. He says there are two things a woman should do by instinct, and one of them is cook." As Lena had hoped, this caused Edward's fork to pause midway between plate and mouth. "So, enough about me. What about your family?" she followed up sweetly. "You already know about the hotels," he said, making a quick recovery. "I manage them in theory, but not hands-on. It's mostly marketing, telling people abroad about Northern Ireland. I go to a lot of conferences, meeting travel agents and so on." "Sounds fascinating," she said, half hoping he noticed the sarcasm. "As you know, I spent most of last month in North America," he ploughed on regardless. "But my weekends are different. Has my father told you about the UDR?" So, he wants to boast about playing soldiers, Lena thought. I'll see about that. The UDR's a bit like part-time Army Reserve, isn't it, she said. You hide in ditches, poke around haystacks, and check the cows aren't booby-trapped. As intended, her levity touched a nerve. Yes, we do spend nights in ditches, cold, wet ones. Otherwise, the IRA would have succeeded in starting a civil war long ago. Lena knew she was skating on thin ice, but something urged her on. You're not after loyalists then, she said, just the IRA. What is it Sinn Féin says? That the UDR are soldiers by day and the UVF by night? Any truth in that? For heaven's sake, Lena, if one of my men were a paramilitary, be out on his ear. Maybe Jeff Hamilton was right that day at Queen's. You people don't have the faintest idea what we're dealing with. Slightly alarmed, Lena changed tack and began a charm offensive with amusing talk of her army childhood. Edward began to relax again, even neglecting his food and grinning at her stories. Dinner over, he asked to be excused to speak to the head waiter, and left alone, Lena reminded herself he was just his father's son, just a small-town hotel manager with a high opinion of himself. Returning, he suggested a nightcap in the hotel bar where someone was playing a grand piano. They settled into easy chairs, and to make conversation, she asked him about the tune. It's called The Black Velvet Band, about a Belfast man whose life is ruined by a dark-haired young lady. Well, you're from Fermanagh, so you're quite safe, she replied. What kind of music do you like, he said. Do you know any Irish music? I know Danny Boy, and that's about it. We'll have to change that, he said, standing up and walking over to the pianist, who stopped playing mid-tune and rose from his seat. Edward took off his jacket, sat down, and began playing a mournful, unmistakably Irish tune. It wasn't an easy piece, yet he played it effortlessly. She watched as his long fingers moved deftly over the keys. This was indeed unexpected. And finally, I want to read a bit about what it was like for me at the time and others to go home to England after spending time in Northern Ireland and in Belfast during the 1980s. As the car made its way west and the spire of Salisbury Cathedral came into sight, Lena felt a sudden desire to gambol through the fields in her bare feet, to sink her face into the wildflowers and throw her arms around the soft purple lupins and pink roses. Beautiful England, lovely, peaceful, and uncomplicated. There was no need to wonder if the people who owned that farm over there were Protestant or Catholic. There were no telltale painted curbs or ragged flags hanging from lampposts. In Ireland, every house and village seemed to have a backstory. Who lives here and who wants them out? On the weekends, she and Edward didn't travel to Fermanagh. They would sometimes drive through his favourite places, the dramatic wild landscapes he tried so hard to sell to tour operators in the US. Early on, he'd taken her on the high road across the basalt plateau of County Antrim, explaining how history had shaped the division of land. Most of the good farming land is in the valleys, he said. Up here, the mountains are only good for grazing sheep or growing conifers. Lena by now knew the significance of that comment and had gazed out of the car window at the modern farmhouses and bungalows dotting the Antrim countryside. Where were the sectarian boundary lines, she wondered? Which contour on the map divided the land? The houses on the road to Salisbury were built of flint and ancient red brick. Clematis-draped gateways revealed tantalizing glimpses of manicured lawns and perennial borders of waving hollyhocks and delphiniums. She caught herself comparing them to the pebble-dash bungalows in Ireland, but quickly reprimanded herself. If your main priority was shelter from the rain and cold, she thought, you mightn't be inclined to waste money on mere decoration. Lena arrived early at the Cathedral Close Cafe in Salisbury and began thinking how she might persuade her friend Olivia that her move to Belfast was not the disaster everybody had confidently predicted. Bang on cue, once they'd ordered sandwiches, her friend echoed her mother's assumptions. It must be absolutely frightful living amongst all that hatred and violence. Lena started off by saying that while the violence was deeply depressing, there were compensations. The countryside is lovely, quite unspoilt and empty. The cottage I'm renting is 200 years old and only 5 minutes from the sea. You're very brave, said Olivia. Still, 4 months gone already and not long till you return to civilization. Strangely, Lena persisted, leaving won't be easy. Okay, Olivia said, persuade me. Lena quickly ran through her head the stories she could tell and those she couldn't. The work is far more interesting than London. One of my clients, for example, is a Protestant paramilitary. He was charged with murdering a Catholic delivery man, but we got him acquitted. Olivia's eyes widened. It seemed encouraging to Lena, so she continued. You'll find this hard to believe, but he's really quite entertaining. Olivia broke cover at that. How can you possibly call a terrorist who may have killed someone just for his religion entertaining? I'm not sure he was guilty. He says the police intimidated an informer into giving false evidence against him. The police did what? Got an informer to lie about him? Listen to yourself, Lena. Police officers have more than enough to do without locking up innocent people. Lena changed the subject, discussing her plans for the cottage garden, and then inevitably Edward merited a mention. He's a straight talker and quite handsome if you like them a bit oversupplied on the testosterone side. Olivia was quick to translate. And what does he do, this gorgeous man? His father runs the legal firm I work for, but Edward manages the family hotel business. Olivia's face fell. Lena could see her conjuring up visions of unappealing dumps on dreary seafronts, Clacton or Skegness with added pointless violence. A month or two earlier, she would have thought the same. Wondering how she might rescue the conversation, Lena hit upon the only virile-sounding description she could think of at short notice. He's also in the army, part-time. You won't have heard of the UDR, the Ulster Defence Regiment, she said, doing her best to sound nonchalant. I've never heard of them myself before I went over. They support the police, looking out for IRA suspects, mounting checkpoints, patrolling the border, that sort of thing. Lena, you're dating a squaddy? You'll have to suspend judgment until you meet him, Lena said limply. On her drive home, Lena reproached herself for failing to explain her growing affection for Northern Ireland. It must have been quite a shock to hear one of her oldest friends talking quite calmly about murderers and the IRA. She wondered how Olivia would describe the meeting to her husband.
Very compelling and interesting. We now have some time for questions from the floor. And I think we have some roving mics from members of staff. Has anyone got a question? And I will try to spy you out. Just put your hand up. Okay, go ahead, sir.
I don't like to be the first person, but anyway. I think it's great to have you here, and thank you for being here. I suppose when I was listening to the last piece, there were two things came up for me. One was I'm actually reading a wonderful poem, Fancy Again Here by Lena Dawson. That kind of balance with being in England around Irish people and what it is to be Irish in Ireland and what it is to be Irish. And I have battled for many years with the whole contradiction around who gets to be Irish, how you find that. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well,
Very big question.
I found it. I found when I went back home to England in those early days that people were constantly saying to me, "Oh, it must be so awful for you. You must be dying to get home." And I was thinking, "No, I love it there. I'm enjoying myself. It's not what you think it is." The first time I ever came to Belfast was on holiday. I took 2 weeks off holiday. I was working in the Bradford Telegraph and Argus in Yorkshire at the time. I took 2 weeks off to come here during the hunger strike to try and get a handle on what was going on. And all the photographs I took when I went home, they were all out of focus, and because my hand was shaking so much because I was so terrified. I did a series of public meetings at Labour Party meetings around Yorkshire. And I still got a job at the BBC after that. So MI5 certainly fell down. But I brought along a plastic bullet, and I brought along copies of the Irish News with all the adverts in them, say such and such a street supports the hunger strikers and everything. It was totally not what I'd expected. Absolutely, completely not what I expected. And I was stunned. And I applied for every job there was going and some that weren't going at the time. And I finally got a job at the BBC in the autumn of that year. But my parents were adamantly opposed to me. I was 28 at the time. My parents really didn't want me to come and work here. My father particularly was very, very racist about the Irish. He didn't want me his daughter coming over here to work at all, and tried to talk me out of it. And I found when I went home on holidays, yes, there was that initial feeling of the heaven, the bliss and the peace of not having to fear to listen, because all of us heard bombs every single day of the week, and you were constantly hearing on the radio about people getting killed. And to be home in England and not to have that was wonderful in a way. But as the time went on, I got less and less tolerant of the attitude that people were expressing around me. And I found it impossible to argue with them because they had absolutely made their minds up. There was no talking to them, no trying to persuade them that actually things were very different over here from what they'd read in the newspapers and heard about. It was virtually impossible, but I did my best. But in the end, I just gave up because there was no point. Because the more you tried, the more they thought there was something wrong with you, that you'd become one of them, and that you weren't English anymore because you were talking about things that they couldn't comprehend or understand. So it was very difficult, and in the end, I just gave up. I suppose in a way I didn't give up because I was still working as a journalist, trying to do what I could. But it was you were talking to a wall. You weren't talking to people who were willing to listen and try and understand. They had already made their minds up. And I'm talking about everybody, not just middle class or working class, everybody. And I don't think that much has actually changed since then.
Thank you. How much of you is in Lena?
Well, well, obviously there are certain principles and beliefs that I have that Lena also has. And one of those beliefs is that, very, very firmly that the law is there to protect everybody. And if the law is corrupted, then there is no protection. I have a ginger cat, so does Lena. I certainly would never have gone out with a UDR man, as we know. So, I mean, in some ways, yes, there's a lot of me and Lena and the other way around, but there's differences as well. When she arrives in Ireland, she thinks that she knows it all. I knew when I arrived in Ireland that I certainly did not know it all, and I kept my mouth shut for a long time. Although, I followed the old adage: whatever you say nothing. But I remember once saying inside the BBC, the Derry City Council had voted to change the name from Londonderry to Derry City Council. And I remember the news came on in a squawk box in the side of the room, and I said, they've done it. And I was hauled over the coals for saying such a thing. That how dare you say that? I as an English person, I had to be very, very careful what I said. And occasionally I did put my foot in it, and I was really, really got into trouble. And I got a reputation for having a certain point of view, which actually wasn't true. I got a reputation for being a bit pro-nationalist. What that wasn't, in fact, true. What was true was that I was prepared to be open-minded. I was prepared to listen. I supported the Birmingham 6 campaign. I remember someone calling me a provo bitch because I supported the Birmingham 6. And that was before I even came to live in Belfast. But it was in those days, unless you were super, super careful about what you said and even what you thought, you could destroy your own career, and you could destroy your own reputation, and you could kiss goodbye to any kind of idea of promotion or that you might have if you were thought in any way, shape, or form to be pro-nationalist. And I wasn't pro-nationalist. I was pro keeping an open mind. I was pro keeping an open mind about whether Republicans were being beaten in Castlereagh. I was pro keeping an open mind about whether there was a shoot to kill policy. I was pro keeping an open mind about human rights abuses. I wasn't pro one side or the other, but I was pro bloody well listening to the evidence and people making their minds up based on the evidence. I always was a doubting Thomas, even when I was writing Lethal Allies. I needed to see the evidence. And I'm not interested in what the dogs in the street say. I'm interested in what can be shown to be proven. And that was the strength of Lethal Allies, because it wasn't what the dogs in the street said or thought. It was based on facts. And the only reason that we were able to write that book was that we got the facts we got what's hidden away, still hidden away, locked up in a place near Carrickfergus, the RUC archives that people can't get into, that nobody's allowed into. And the facts and the truth and reality of what happened here, a lot of it is locked up in those archives, and we can't get to them. And evidence is what people need, and evidence is what this society needs to understand what happened here during the 35 years. Now, in this book, Lena is searching for evidence. She's asked to represent, after she succeeds to a certain extent in representing her loyalist client, she's then approached to act on behalf of a Republican. And she doesn't believe his story at all, but he challenges her, if you believe in rule of law and justice, you'll take up my case. And so she says, okay, I'll try. But she doesn't believe it. And that she then sets out on a long, long journey trying to find the truth about whether the Republicans telling the truth or the police are telling the truth. And that is something that I did when I, in my career. But it's so difficult when the truth is locked up behind heavy bars and big gates. Tim.
So after all those years of writing journalism, what made you want to write a novel, and how did it feel to do that?
In some ways, it was heaven, because when you're a journalist, everything has to be sourced and referenced. And that was the strength of Lethal Allies, was that everything was sourced and referenced. Nobody could argue with anything because it was all there in black and white, and we had proof of everything that was in the book. So in a way, when I started writing fiction, it was absolute bliss. You could write about anything you wanted to. You didn't have to justify it. You could take the characters wherever you wanted them to go, twist and turn, and think, would it be interesting if that happened or that happened? And you didn't have to provide proof or evidence of any of it. You can just write whatever came into your head. And it was wonderful, the freedom that gave you. You could write, fiction can be true. It can also tell important truths, otherwise it would be worthless. But other than pure entertainment. But what I also found was that wasn't quite so nice was that if you change anything, I mean, crossing over is very densely plotted. It's timed, and things happen, and then other things happen, and other things happen. So everything happens in a sequence, and it's quite densely plotted. If you have a dense plot, when a number of characters who all behave in a certain way, if you change anything in the middle, you have to go back to the beginning and rewrite everything that leads up to that point. And then you have to write everything again that leads on from that point. Because a friend of mine told me when I started writing that every single word in a good book of fiction has to be justified on grounds of theme, character, and plot. So, you have to, nothing's there by accident. There's nothing in crossing over that isn't there for a reason. And so if you do change anything, then you have to change anything at all, even a minor detail, then you have to change everything that leads up to that point and everything that leads on from that point in order that everything flows and that people behave the way they do, because there's a reason for them behaving the way they do. For example, there's one story in the book about when Lena's a schoolgirl and she's not good at maths. Now, that is a bit like me. And because she's failed a maths exam, the rest of the school are all taken to go to the cinema, to go to Dr. Zhivago at Odeon at Marble Arch in Charabangs. And everybody and the teachers go with them. So the whole school, she's at a boarding school. So the whole school goes off to this wonderful evening at the cinema in London. And Lena is left behind all on her own in this echoing, huge boarding school. And she's absolutely furious with the unfairness of it. And she's lonely and scared and on her own and feels completely powerless. And I tell that story at the start of the book. And it's justified because at much, much later on in the book, she has that same feeling of utter and absolute powerlessness, that she has gone she's had huge victories through the courts, but still nothing happens. Still, despite the fact that things have been said and done through the courts, that she's provided evidence, still nothing happens. Still the police who have told the lies are still in their jobs. Still the politicians make excuses for the events that have happened. And that she really feels completely powerless. And she says in the book, it reminds me of nothing so much as when I was at school, when everybody else went off to the cinema and I was stuck at school on my own. She says that same feeling of complete and utter powerlessness and unfairness and a lack of justice and injustice. So that was one of the most satisfying things about writing the book, was that I can express those feelings and why Lena felt the way she felt, which is, I have to say, on occasion, I felt the same way. Because when I worked for the Pat Finucane Centre, we did win major court cases and still nothing happened, and still we're waiting. And there are people here in this room tonight who know exactly what I'm talking about, that no matter how many times you beat them, they come back with something else. They've got deep pockets and they're prepared to tell the most outrageous, egregious lies. And you're left feeling completely powerless in the face of the state.
I'm just interested. You said you would never go out to a VD Harman, and I was thinking, seemed to be really good fun. A very good listener.
I can't imagine that situation. I can't imagine. I did go out with a soldier once, but that was before I came to Ireland. And he was only a part-timer, and he did it just for fun, I think.
You've described your book as a bit of a genre-bending book, with it being a bit of a political thriller, a legal drama with some romance thrown in. Why does it cross so many genres?
Because real life is like that. Because real life, I've lived it. If you ask people that are really involved in their work, and their work involves fighting through the courts or taking human rights on fighting human rights issues, there's no people are rounded, that they have lives outside. People might be involved in as lawyers or politicians or whatever, but they also have a human side to them, and I think I wanted to write a book that expressed that you'll find there are episodes in the book where Lena thanks God for her wee cat, that she can go to sleep at night. The only thing that calms her at the end of the day is her cat being on the bed beside her and kind of purring. And I've been in that situation. I think we all have, where we have been really up against it in our work. And if our work involves the courts and human rights and people getting killed and injustice, we're still human, and we still need to eat and sleep and somehow or other keep our heads together through all the horrors and the disappointments and the victories and the half victories that we encounter in life. That you still have to, that you're still a human being, and you still need 3 meals a day and to sleep and you find love in unexpected places. I never expected to meet and fall in love and get married to Mr. O'Hare, and I did, but yet I did. It wasn't something I decided. It just happened.
Was there ever a worry when you were developing your character, Lena, that you were getting too close to some of the factual people that you've come across in your previous role?
Sorry, how do you mean, like
that your storylines or any of the plots that you're following were going to reflect truth? That's some of the journalist stories that you would have covered here. Was there ever a worry that you were going to portray somebody that maybe could be recognised?
Well, yes. I had to be careful. Some people will say that some of the characters I've written about are easily identifiable. I don't. I tried to make it sort of. I tried to make certainly the main characters. I don't think I've ever come across anyone like Edward. Lena, yes, there are women in this city who are fighting the good fight, and I admire them. I was a friend of Rosemary Nelson's. She certainly was a very courageous woman and ploughed a very lonely furrow. And we know what happened to Rosemary. So, there's a bit of Rosemary in Lena, certainly. There's a bit of Pat Finucane in her as well. Lawyers who are abused in public and called IRA lawyers and that sort of thing, which puts them at risk of losing their lives. Yeah, and I mean, the loyalist, Darren Barrett, who he becomes a wrestler and he's called the Shankill Stinger. There's certainly people who you could say he resembles, but not closely enough, I think, for my learned friends to take me to court for. Let's hope. I wanted to make it as real as possible and as authentic as possible, but not so authentic that people could recognize themselves and say, that's me. So it was, you sail as close to the wind as you can. But I hope I've sailed sufficiently close to the wind to make it authentic and real and believable, but they're not ciphers for people who really exist. What I've written is fiction. It's made up. It's a story. It's made up.
I'm sorry if it's a very negative question, but I'm going to try and end up on a positive note. Lena goes back to England and she's relieved that there are no flags and painted curbs. But there are flags and painted curbs in England now. And there are also people here on this island actively trying to unite Catholics and Protestants in hatred for Muslims and migrants. But I just wanted to hear what your comment might be on the ongoing struggle, really, against hatred and disinformation, but also to not end on a negative note. There is also quite an active attempt on behalf of the people to organize against it. So I just wanted to ask if you had any word of encouragement, because it seems like I'm looking forward to reading the book, and I think it's going to resonate for a very long time.
Well, one of the reasons I lived in Dublin for a while. I lived in Bradford as well, in West Yorkshire for a while, which has a large Muslim population, and I loved it. It was great. You get on the bus in the morning, and there'd be saris and people wearing exotic jewelry, and there'd be wonderful, very cheap curry houses and everything. It was great. And the National Front was organizing then. And I was a journalist on the local paper, so I wasn't involved directly in the marches, but I covered the marches. And I have to say, when I first came to Belfast and saw my first Orange Parade, it took me back to Bradford and the kind of, rubbing people's noses in it and provocative marches. It reminded me of the National Front in Bradford. But when I lived in Dublin for a while, and while I lived there was none of this. There was none of this racism that I'm actually horrified about. I thought Ireland was going to be free of that. I couldn't imagine a country where people had emigrated for generations, for centuries, allowing that to take root for one instant. And, but now I accept that there is a problem here with that, and it horrifies me. And I'm not, I'm not involved in actively campaigning against it, but I'm very, very sorry. I really thought the Irish were going to be able to rise above that and not go down that road at all. And I don't think they are going down that road. I think the vast majority of people in Ireland accept that emigration is part of living in the 20th and 21st centuries. But there are some, and they need to be exposed and for what they are, which is out and out racists. I mean, racism is wrong wherever it is. I mean, my father was a horrific racist. And people I know in England are racist about the Irish. And it hurts me that the Irish could be racist themselves. But as I said, it's only a minority, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to believe that is anything other than a small minority who are capable of being won round.
I'm interested in where your values originate, that influenced your drive for pursuit of evidence and truth. And
Well, it's very inconvenient. I look at other people and who don't feel as angry as I am, and as kind of fueled to do something about it as I am. And I often wish, why can't I live? Why can't I? I love gardening. I mean, there's all sorts of bits about me that people don't know. I love gardening. I adore music. I mean, without music, I would have done away with myself a long time ago. I mean, music and gardening, I have other bits of my life that are really, really important to me. But I don't know where it comes from. I really don't know. But I wish it, and I often wish it didn't, because I don't think I've really been able to make any real difference. But there's something that drives me on. I don't know what it is, and as I said, I often wish it didn't do it. It wasn't there. It may have been boarding school. When if you sucked up to the staff, you were treated properly. And if you didn't like sport, which I hated sport, and if you weren't terribly good at, I was quite good at English and history, but that was about it, nothing else. I was hopeless at all kind of science subjects. And I always felt that I wasn't really up to much, and that I wouldn't ever amount to anything. And I suppose that gave me a fellow feeling for other people who felt the same way. And now, when I look at the news now, and I see a block of flats being felled by some wretched bomb from one side or the other, I mean, I feel physically sick sometimes. I think of all the people in those flats whose lives have been destroyed in a second, whose bedrooms, whose drawers full of clothes, whose lives, whose hopes and dreams have just been flattened. And you feel completely hopeless. What can you do about it? And it's going on even as we talk now. And what can any of us do about it? And that is that feeling of hopelessness again. But you have to fight against that, because surely in the end, good will prevail, we hope.
Firstly, how did you find writing fiction after years of writing facts? And the second one is, what do you enjoy reading most?
Well, journalism, it was utterly liberating writing fiction. I absolutely loved it. I mean, I was going through a lot of difficult times, but the book kept me going. I absolutely loved it. I could lose myself. I say, right, I'll go up to my office and for 5 minutes and just correct something. And I'd sit down to correct something, and then I'd go on to something else. And then 2 or 3 hours later, I'd suddenly look at, oh my God Almighty, look at the time. It was. I wish I'd started this a long, long time ago, because I find it really liberating and hugely enjoyable, just creating people out of nowhere and writing about them, and then really coming to believe that they really exist. I mean, Lena and Edward to me were very, very real when I was facing into a very hard time in health-wise, and I had lots of things happening to me that were horrible. I could lose myself in the book, absolutely lose myself in it, and believe Lena and Edward were more real to me than anybody else in my life. And it was, and if you really believe in your characters, then the dialogue flows. You don't have to make it up. It just happens. And it's just like this electricity running through your fingers onto the computer keyboard, and it's effortless. You like your fingers move of their own free will. You don't have to make any effort at all. It just comes. And it's lovely when that happens. It's an absolutely beautiful feeling. As Tim will tell you, we have another author here who I'm sure you'll say the same, Tim. When you're on a roll, it's well, when you're on a roll, you know it. You know it because when you believe in your characters and you're fond of them and you can see their weaknesses and their strengths, and it just flows out of you. It's absolutely wonderful.
Mine's a big follow on to that. First of all, congratulations. What you've done is just such a brilliant and wonderful thing. So I wanted to ask you just, can you ever go back? You've talked about being liberated from the tyranny of footnotes, and you've just spoken there about that wonderful liberation of being able to write fiction. Is it a case that once you've gone there, you can never go back? Could you ever imagine going back to the forensic?
Anna, I'm 72. The fact that I'm here at all is a minor miracle. No, I don't think I could ever go back. I don't think anybody would have me, quite apart from anything else. I think when I wrote Lethal Allies, having said that, when I wrote Lethal Allies, there were some of my colleagues in journalism who were very sniffy about it and who didn't talk to me and would look the other way if they ever met me in the street or anything. But since John Boucher wrote his recent report on Glenanne and referenced the book, and it was uniquely became an exhibit in the High Court. I think that my former colleagues who were sniffy about me, maybe not quite so sniffy anymore. But I hardly ever see them, so I don't worry about that anymore. But I mean, what you just said, it was very brave of you. I absolutely hated that when I was a journalist, that people would say, "Oh, it's so brave of you." I thought, what the fuck have I done? Bloody hell, shit. Because to be brave in this society and to speak out and to say things that not people don't particularly want to hear, it's not terribly popular, and you can get into all sorts of trouble. And I have. I won't tell you in this forum, but sometime later, I'll tell you about a few Christmas parties I've been to where drink has flowed, and my colleagues and others have really felt that the shackles were off and it was time to get stuck into Cadwallader. And I stopped going to Christmas parties after a while because I knew what I was in for. But no, I can't imagine myself ever going back. No, I'm too old for that. There's other young, talented people, much more talented than me, coming, blah, 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 No. I'm thinking, I have started writing a sequel, which will be focused on collusion, which is the most difficult subject. Because if you're talking about evidence, and if you want evidence, if you want your book to be based on evidence and be authentic and be believable, then evidence is very hard to get as far as collusion is concerned, because as I've said over and over again in the past, collusion is a crime where the people who committed the crime are in charge of the evidence. And therefore, how are you going to get the evidence when the people who did the wrong acts are the people themselves who have control of that evidence that you want to get to? And something else which I really want to say before we end, and that is that I absolutely believe there are no shortcuts to ending conflicts like the one that we've all just been through. And we should have been able to rely on our governments to know that to be able to tell the difference between right and wrong, and to understand that if you want to bring a conflict to an end, you don't, killing people illegally, SAS executions, beating people up in prison, lying about people in court cases, hiring people to be agents and send them out into the community. It's just all those shortcuts that the government, British government, thought that they were being so clever with, and it was justified, bending the law and breaking the law, because wasn't it justified because they were facing against an armed insurrection? Absolutely solves nothing. All it does is prolong the conflict even further, because people are not stupid. They can see what's going on. They understand what's going on, and it alienates them from the state, and it just creates more and more trouble and prolongs the conflict. I absolutely profoundly believe that. And that is something that underpins the book that I've just written, Fiction or Fact.
Hi, Anne. Oh, over here. To your left. Yes. I just have the question related to. There is a generation that's entering into living in Belfast, Northern Ireland, in as close to a post-trouble mindset as can be. A lot of people have immigrated here, so they hear about the troubles in the context of friends, word of mouth, what they're hearing on the streets, what they're hearing in and around, however they enter into living here. There's also a generation that's coming in, having heard from closer to home. They've seen or experienced the pain, the guilt, the anger, whatever it may be secondhand. But they see things only in the lens of second person view. If that generation, if a younger adult is to happen upon your book, what do you want them to take away from it, importantly?
I want them to take away from it what it was like to live here in Belfast in the 1980s, to understand how grim it was, how it forced people into making decisions that they may otherwise not have taken, how the corruption of the law is no good for anyone ever, how extrajudicial murders are no answer to any problem that anyone has ever faced ever, and the fact that people who were who good people, basically good people, ended up doing dreadful things because they were forced into corners and boxed in and lashed out as a result. I don't know if it will have that effect, but I suppose if all that new generation, but there's also the problem, of course, of there is, of course, a new generation coming up, and there are people moving in who weren't here before, but there are also, I mean, there's intergenerational trauma, and I know that's an awful cliche that people trot out, but I've seen it in my work, which is that when someone is killed, and not only are they killed in a sectarian way, but they're killed in a sectarian way that the state condoned. And then they discover that goes down through the generations. That sense of anger and injustice lasts. I've talked to great-grandchildren of people who were killed as a result of collusion, who feel that there is this terrible burden on them that they have to fight and fight and fight to get to the truth. And it's an awful thing to pass on to a new generation. And we really shouldn't expect young people to have to face up to that.
It just remains for me then to wrap up this evening to say a very big thank you for everyone for coming along and showing such interest. I'm sure that you're all really looking forward, those of you who haven't read the book already. And are you going to be around for a little while signing copies?
Yeah, I mean, this conversation here tonight has been quite serious, and is focused in on some quite serious issues. But I just want to say that the book should be extremely enjoyable. I really enjoy it. There's no bullshit at all. I really enjoyed writing it. It was a pleasure to write, not necessarily a pleasure to edit, but it was a pleasure to write. And I mean, the people who've read it so far say they really enjoy it. And that to me is wonderful, that people can enjoy. There's difficult and dangerous subjects that the book's about, but it's written in a way that is, I think, you can really get involved in it emotionally. I certainly did, and I hope if those of you who read it, I really hope you enjoy it, and I believe you will, because it's a gripping read. It's a gripping read.
I can certainly second that. Thank you.